Welcome back to my Fire Emblem Thracia 776 Ironman. This is Chapter 4 Gaiden, which its name you could translate as Hero of the Wind, or Heroes of the Wind, if you go on that whole bit about plurality that I touched on a couple chapters back. You could include Asbel in that if you want, as he is a burgeoning hero of sorts. Most of the action is condensed into like one or two very important turns in this chapter, and the rest of it is kind of, it's a small map and there aren't any real nasty surprises like in the last chapter or in the next chapter for that matter. This is just kind of, it's almost like it's your reward for being diligent with the civilians in the previous chapter. And there are some places where you have to be careful, especially in the very beginning. The beginning is where most people are going to run into problems. But there's this nice little intro with the rest of the Magi, as they are here, and they're going to help us out, sort of. You'll see. I suppose maybe Seti really is the focal point of this chapter, so maybe he is just the hero of wind, or the hero of the wind. A lot of this chapter is really just about his character, especially with the, I don't know if it's a hidden conversation you can uncover. The conversation, the talks in this game are sort of, they don't ever really indicate to you that they can happen. You just kind of have to put characters next to each other, and occasionally you see that talk function. A lot of the newer, or I guess it's just one patch, lets you see the talk bubbles, which I think is a good implementation. I think if the team that made this game could do it over again, they probably would have put that function in, don't you think? Maybe not. I don't have a window into their minds. But one little bit of inventory management that I didn't touch on in the last chapter, I don't think, is that Dhalsim starts with a torch, and I like to put it on like Lara or Lithis before the last chapter ends, so that they can use the torch on this chapter. And the reason that matters, at least in my mind, is that you're going to want to use Dhalsim for positioning more so in the first chapter, and you kind of need the info from the torch in order to make that decision. So there's sort of three distinct enemy type groups to deal with here. There's mages, there's armors, and there's the regular soldiers. And the soldiers are incredibly weak typically, unless they roll like a really high strength stat, but I've never seen that be an issue. So unless you're leaving your thieves in their line of sight, it's not really that big of a deal. You can just pretend they're not there almost. These armors and the mages are what you have to worry about. And basically, depending on where you stand, you might either attract a mage or an armor and two mages, is usually how it works out. But you have to check them all for extra movement, because that can really mess up your whole plan. And there's enough of these units where that is likely to happen. Probably one of them will have an extra point of move. I don't think it happened to me here, actually, but never take that for granted. And then basically, what you want to do if you want to move reasonably quickly is put Dhalsim in range of one of the armors, and put Fergus probably, or maybe Brighton, like say if you are Iron Manning also and you lost Fergus, in range of another. And that's what I end up doing here, with Karen supporting Fergus and Leaf supporting Dhalsim. They're probably okay, even if two mages attack them. And then from that point on, you can just manage it in roughly the same way as the last enemy group from the last map. Although this group is, when all is said and done, probably a bit less dangerous just because of the circumstances. You have a little more time and a little more space to work with. Although that does go for the enemies somewhat as well, I suppose. And I have actually lost Dhalsim here once. He was going for a Brave Axe hit. He would have one-shot a mage, and he missed both attacks on like 90 accuracy, and the mage struck him down. I don't remember if it was a critical or what. Probably not, because I usually put a scroll on it. But that's kind of a freak incident there. I probably was overlooking something. Otherwise, this whole section here is pretty reliable, I think. One thing you have to look out for is, I think some of these armors have some of the more powerful enemy-only weapons, sort of. I mean, of course, you can get them through capturing, but they have things like great swords and stuff, and these long swords actually sort of hit hard, but the nice thing is that they're a little bit less accurate on the whole than weapons that the player has access to. But Fergus makes short work of them, and Dhalsim, unless he misses a 90, will probably kill his target as well. So Lifis, as he was before, is useful for disabling mages effectively, and some of them have vulneraries if you're really cheeky about it. I wouldn't recommend capturing at this point. But up at the top, Asbel and Seti are doing some battling of their own, and you have absolutely no control over this. No matter how fast you go, these guys will always have to fight on their own. And you want to hope that most of them go for Seti, because he is literally invincible, just like with Avel, and he also has unlimited Forseti uses, whereas Asbel, if he attacks anyone, he will use up his very valuable Graph Caliber Tome, which we'll get into in a little while. And he can also die, although I've never personally seen it happen, either in my own playthroughs or in somebody else's. I've seen him get hit. I think I might even have seen him get hit twice, but I've never seen him die. But he can use his own, I think he has a vulnerary that he can use. So ultimately he's just there to aggravate you in this whole opening section here. But that's okay. Don't get too worked up over it, especially if you're Iron Manning. Don't reset just because he used 5 uses of his tome or anything. So it's also good to check these guys just even on like the second turn, just to double check their attack powers. Like if you're trying to figure out which mage's tome you should take, I always try and take the one with the highest attack power, which might seem obvious and it might seem like micromanaging to some, but it could definitely save your life. And then what I ended up doing here also is doing that same thing I did last chapter, where I steal a tome and then I just offer up Lifis as capture bait. And you know, you lose that tome, and that kind of does suck in a way because it's ammo for Asbel. So you definitely want to make sure that you're not carrying any errant pieces of equipment from the last chapter, which can be kind of a mess, and you might have traded some stuff around, and you will continue to do so. But you know, you can even get units like Karen up to snuff here. You can train weapon ranks and get a little bit of experience. And Karen is one of those units that you kind of get out what you put into her as far as her future utility goes. You can get her up to like C swords throughout the game, and that's actually kind of useful in some niche ways. And you can also, not right now, but in like 2 chapters, you can start training her lance rank, which also has some niche uses later on. It's tough to do unless you can manage to find the right lance. She can only use short lances, and some people actually like to capture one in like the first chapter and then pass it on to her. I wouldn't really recommend doing that, because that's just another chest you have to open in the previous chapter. But here you still see Dhalsim putting in insane amounts of work. That Brave Axe hit, if I'm not sure if I actually end up attacking that mage with him, but it one-shots that mage. And as I went over, that can backfire, but I don't think it can in this instance. So really, this is the part that tests you as far as just knowing what your unit's strengths are, even the weakest ones, and just taking advantage of that. And those 2 cells on the left, which are empty, they're not darkened or anything, they just really are empty, are what I spoke about briefly in the last chapter about how sometimes if units get captured, they will appear in the next chapter. This may be one of those instances. It might be one of the ones that was taken out at the last minute. And then in the right cells are the kids that you have to rescue, and these ones are much easier to manage than in the last chapter because they escape just at that point to the right outside their cells. Not that big staircase, they just exit right. And it's really easy, you don't have to babysit them. So once you have enough enemies cleared, you can just let them right out. As long as you're not taking too long, because eventually reinforcements will come in this bottom part of the map. But if you're moving reasonably quickly, this isn't an issue, especially because of later on after you've opened that door up there, SETI will eventually make his way down there unless you pull off some rescue shenanigans, sort of. Remember that Karen receives support bonuses from Fergus in reverse, so she also can be used to take one hit maybe, or dodge a hit probably reasonably well, unless it's one of those armors that has like a great sword and rolled a ton of strength. Then it might be kind of scary. But she also, don't forget, as a Pegasus Knight, she actually has a magic stat, so she can be used to take a mage hit if you want, and she's actually one of the better units that you have right now for doing that. Unless Fergus has enough weapon rank to use the flame sword, and you brought that, in which case that gives him +5 magic, and he can kill the unit back, so maybe he would be a better candidate at that point. But I like to conserve the flame sword a little bit and not use it so much for stuff like that, unless it really does help. But eventually, Sid and Asbel make it over to this part of the map, and they just kind of stay there. You'll notice that there's enemy units up at the very top, and there are some with 2 range, but they don't get triggered to move until you've opened one of the 2 doors past this double door in the room where you are currently, or where I am currently, as it may be. So this is turn 3 or turn 4, and I'm already wrapping up this section, so hopefully these kinds of tactics will help you in this section. It's very reliable if you just take your time and think about your placement. And the rest of the chapter is pretty easy, although I do manage to make it dicey, because that's just how I am. But I'll tell you some ways that you can make it not dicey at all, maybe at the expense of sacrificing a little bit of experience, but in the grand scheme of things, that shouldn't matter too much to you. Something to think about at this point in time is that if you're like me and you used one of the thieves to use the torch, I would say try and get that thief to head up top right at this moment, preferably with a lockpick, especially if you have 2. I only had 1. I chose not to bring Liphus's lockpick to Manster this time. Sometimes I bring both just for general utility. But the reason for that is Having extra vision can be a huge boon if you plan on getting the treasure in the upper left of this map. It lets you plan out the enemy formations in regard to your own, just to set up enemy faces. It can really be invaluable, and if you take a little bit too long, your vision will wane to the point where it's sort of wasted. Although obviously its main use is for this initial enemy group, and you can still manage without it, so don't worry too much. And any other units that just don't really have a use here anymore should also head up and start getting into place for whatever the next phase of your strategy is. Something I don't think I mentioned in the last chapter is that Gaiden and Matcha come with more than one sword each. So that's a reason why you don't want to bring things like iron swords into Manster. And you also have opportunities to get other swords pretty easily. I think there's one in one of the default chests in the last chapter. 4 of those chests, I think, have just default items in them. They have like a javelin and like a folder area, I think. Ultimately kind of useless items, but yeah, I get them anyway. At this point, I remembered that Lara does need to open that door up in the upper left post-haste, so I kind of did this awkward trade chain. And I think I even made it less efficient than it needed to be. So I try not to pay too much attention to that. If you've been watching the video closely enough, and you didn't already know, maybe you picked up on the fact that Thracia has very, very liberal trading. You can trade as many times as you want with as many surrounding allies in one turn, and that's really useful. Although it kind of can get you into like a micromanaging mindset sometimes. So I try to just, once you get preps, I try to just prep as well as you can. But, you know, there are things that you can't really plan for mid-chapter. Here you'll see that Asbel is actually one of those funny units that recruits himself. So if you don't actually have to chase him down with Leaf, you can just place Leaf in such a way that Asbel is in range. Although I think even if you're not in range and the door is open, he will run toward you anyway. So basically just don't waste an action if you don't have to, since turn economy can make things a lot easier if you pay attention to it in this chapter. And Asbel is a little bit more into Leaf than Leaf is into Asbel, and that's kind of funny. There is one more interaction that you definitely want to engage in this chapter, and that's Karen to Ced. And that one you do have to initiate on your own. He won't chase her down. So make sure to do that. You do get a good item. And there is a conversation that happens there that is actually the focus of my little Japanese segment here, so stay tuned. And as you can see, Asbel can actually get a movement star after having recruited himself. I forgot about that when I made my notes. That is pretty funny. I've never seen that happen before. So now that Lara has given us vision here, we can see that there is a treasure room, and it has the only female mage in the entire game, I think. Friendly or enemy. And that's not counting Miranda, who is like a different sort of mage, because she promotes into a mage knight. Whereas presumably this mage would promote into a sage. I think that's the implication, because she has the same sort of like sprite makeup as like the Asbels of the world, and the enemy mages, the male ones that is. I think that's the idea here, but all I know is that you can't see that sprite anywhere else that I can remember. And then there is an axer with a devil axe, one of the only two in the game, I think. And you can try and steal that if you want, but you should know that it doesn't actually sell for that much, so it's not really worth it. The only person who could have a reasonable chance at capturing him is Dawson, and I wouldn't put too much effort into that. But these are chests that you definitely want to get. This room isn't too heavily guarded. And one thing you should know is that if you're the kind of person who likes fighting all of the enemies yourself, if Ced is not in the space he's in right now, but in any of the like 5 spaces to the left of where he is, when you open that door or the other door, he will actually bear the brunt of the bishop's attack and like at least 2 of the regular enemies in that room on the right, because now they are aggressive, sort of, I guess. I don't know what the enemy logic is really, but they will now perceive that he is on the other side of the wall and attack, and he will obliterate them. So if you wanted some of those items that are on like the bishop, for example, then just be aware of that. You can rescue Ced if you want. Again, I don't think it's really worth the micromanagement, but that group can be dangerous if you try to take them on all at once, and you'll see why in a little bit here. At this point, if you've accumulated any fire and thunder tomes, you should give them over to Asbel. During low levels, Asbel will have trouble doubling, and his magic stat isn't that great either, which is pretty normal for low-level recruited mages. If he uses the Graph Caliber tome, his offense is insane, and he often can double even at base level, I think. So, a couple things. You do want to use Graph Caliber during Manster where you think it might be useful. Don't conserve it too heavily, even though it is one of the best weapons in the game. So, let me just talk about the intelligent way to go about this last room here, which is, what you probably should do is just open the door from the bottom. You can use, like, rescue tactics to get Ced or Cedi into the doorway, and he'll just take care of the room for you. Because these guys, there's nothing you really want to capture that badly or anything. And the experience just isn't worth it. I mean, you could also just drop him like one square to the left of where he is now, and just have him get rid of a few of the units, and then just clean up the rest of them yourself from another angle. That's just... I really should have done that and not messed around here. Let me talk about the fatigue thing here for a moment. The first chapter after Manster, which is the first chapter where you actually feel the repercussions of fatigue, you have to capture a unit in order to unlock the Gaiden, and it's the boss unit, essentially. So you need strong units, preferably like mounted ones. And so when you think about who you're using, who you're leaning on heavily throughout Manster, it's like, well, Matcha doesn't matter. Karen doesn't matter. You probably won't fatigue her anyway, even if you're using her for a bit of combat. Brighton doesn't really matter, because, I don't know, he's just Brighton. And his Wrath skill doesn't help you with capturing anything. I mean, that's his, like, signature thing that he does. Otherwise, he's a pretty pedestrian unit. Unless, I guess you give him the Brave Axe, maybe. Asbel doesn't really matter for that purpose. I mean, he's great, but he won't help you capturing that unit. The Thieves are whatever. The only unit that we have right now that I would consider maybe managing their fatigue a bit is Fergus. Usually I end up with him fatigued by the end of this, just because I'm leaning on him so heavily. But if you get the Brave Sword out of one of these chests here, he can help you with that capture maneuver. So it's not strictly necessary, especially if you have a really good Finn. But if you don't have a good Finn, or you didn't bother to train him up a little bit in those first 3-4 chapters, then you might want to consider holding Fergus back a little. So here's the Karen said conversation. And first what I'll say is, I've noticed that across all the different translations and perceptions of Karen, that the whole approach to her personality is kind of inconsistent. Sometimes she's like playful, sometimes she's respectful and formal, sometimes she's like kind of just a dumb kid, and maybe it's like sort of all in between those three options. So maybe I would say that nobody's approach is really incorrect. It's just that they didn't get the mix right, maybe. But at the end of the day, this whole conversation and this whole chapter is more about Seti. And I think it's particularly kind of funny that in a subtle sort of way, he's kind of hitting on her here, especially at the end when he gives her the Seti scroll, because he kind of just casually mentions like, yeah, well, I'm supposed to give this to the queen during her inauguration, because he's the prince of Celeste, and will one day be the king, presumably. In fact, I think with his mother's death, that makes him the king now, doesn't it? But as far as Karen's sort of immaturity, there's this funny part where she uses the phrase "tondemo arimasen," and the best way I can explain that phrase is like when you were a kid and you were growing up with, like your particular generation, was there ever a word or phrase that you used that adults and teachers and the like were always saying to you, like, that's not grammatically correct, or that's not a real word? And then once you grew up, it's like it got added to the dictionary. So, I mean, that's just how language works. That's just how parlance goes. People, all words are made up, and they get used enough to the point where they become words. And tondemo arimasen is that in Japanese. So it's used at this part where Seti gives her the scroll, and she's just like, no way. So that just kind of makes her sound like a funny little kid, and she's like 14 or so, so that definitely fits. And before you start thinking of Seti as a creep, I think he's 16, so I guess that's a fair game if you are to say that he really is like sort of hitting on her a little bit. And I think that actually fits, because part of his whole development here, and even a little bit in Fire Emblem 4, is that he has a lot of issues with his father, with Lewin or Levin or whatever his name is. But he's also very much like him in a lot of ways. And I think he knows it. So I think that whole bit is maybe lost a little bit, because from what I remember in some of the translations, he's very upright and formal and everything, and that little hint of his father is not carried over so much. If I have a particular section of the text that I think exemplifies that, I'll include it in the description. But here you can see that I miscalculated a little bit just how much punishment Dhalsim can take. But luckily, so these armors actually have battle axes on them, but because they also have hand axes, they virtually always will decide to use the hand axe. And what was funny is that they all took up enough space so that this bishop had to attack at one range. And luckily, Dhalsim just barely survived here, but that was definitely a mistake. And the proper action would have been to do one of those things to let Seti help out, or just to hang back one square back from where Dhalsim is. I think that would have worked also. That would have allowed Asbel to take care of some of these units from behind the wall, maybe even have Leaf do the same thing with the light brand. The only other way this can play out at this point in the map is that if you took longer to get here than I did, and reinforcements have come up from the bottom, then Seti will start moving that way to take care of those. So regardless of how you approach this map, you don't ever have to worry about the reinforcements so much, unless you play so slowly that even at this point you're still down there. Then I guess it's sort of a problem, but I think they're just crappy soldiers, like they are in the last chapter. that was kind of a waste of graph caliber. Probably what I should have done is just because I had to have some of my units catch up here anyway. I probably should have just hung back and let Dulcin take a hit from the javelin and then just take care of him with a combination of like Leaf and Matcha and everybody on the next turn. So I don't really know why I did that. But again, you can't worry too much about little stuff like that. Unless you're doing it constantly, if you're just using everything willy-nilly. The Brave Sword is the real prize here, I think. It just turns Fergus into a killing machine, and a capturing machine too. And my suggestion is to use it pretty liberally. For some reason, whenever I play this game, I always end up like at the end of the game with a ton of Brave Sword uses left. Something about like Fergus in like late game, I find, just kind of falls off in terms of utility. I don't really know why, because he's one of the only ones who can remain at full power even indoors. So maybe this is just a little quirk of me rather than something that holds up to reality. But definitely make good use of it here in Mancer. You can capture some stuff that you wouldn't normally be able to capture, and etc., and so on and so forth. So there's not much left to talk about in this chapter. It's just everybody escaping, and there's no outro. So you can stay and watch that if you wish, but I will sign off here. And thank you for watching. Hope you enjoy the next chapter. It's one of my favorites, and I will see you next time.